There is a clock ticking right now on the southern flank of this war, and when it stops, one of Moscow's oldest lies about Kherson stops with it. The lie was that the Dnipro was a wall, that the West Bank was Ukrainian, the East Bank was Russian, and the water between them would freeze this front in place until a negotiated map decided the rest. That lie died this month. It died quietly on a narrow strip of sand between the Black Sea and the Dnipro estuary, when Ukrainian soldiers walked onto ground Moscow had held for 4 years and raised a blue and yellow flag on the roof of a building the Kremlin had told its own generals was unbreakable. There is a clock ticking right now, because what happened on the Kinburn Spit is not a symbolic photograph. It is the first visible fracture in a defensive system Russia spent 48 months building, and it exposes a truth Moscow has been trying to hide since the summer offensive stalled. The Kherson front is not holding. It is being hollowed out. And this is not a story about a lost peninsula. It is a case study in why the assumption that Russia can permanently freeze this war along the Dnipro was always going to fail. On June 25, 2026, the Regional Command of Ukraine's Southern Defense Forces confirmed what commercial satellite imagery and Ukrainian drone footage had begun to suggest days earlier. Ukrainian units, following what the command described as a powerful fire strike, forced Russian occupation troops to abandon their defensive lines on the Kinburn Spit, evacuate their surviving personnel, and cede a piece of ground Moscow had held continuously since March 10, 2022. The location matters. The Kinburn Spit is a narrow sand tongue extending from the Kinburn Peninsula in occupied Kherson Oblast, sitting directly across from the port city of Ochakiv in Mykolaiv region. It commands the maritime approach to the Dnipro estuary, the sea gate to the ports of Mykolaiv and Kherson, and the northwestern corner of the Black Sea. The statement from the Southern Command was blunt. Quote, as a result of a powerful fire strike, the defense forces of the South forced the occupiers to retreat from their positions. Evacuation of surviving personnel is underway, and the Russian forces are leaving their defensive lines. End quote. That was not a casual statement. That was a formal military confirmation that a 4-year Russian foothold on the Black Sea, one used to shell Ochakiv, harass shipping, and threaten the Odessa maritime corridor, has been broken. Now step back and look at the bigger picture, because if you only see the flag, you miss the mechanism. For most of the last 3 years, Western analysts, mainstream commentators, and even portions of Kiev's own political class operated on a set of assumptions about the Kherson front that were quietly convenient to Moscow. Assumption 1, after the Ukrainian liberation of Kherson City in November 2022, the war on the southern axis was effectively frozen because the Dnipro River was too wide to cross under fire. Assumption 2, the failed Krinky bridgehead operation, which Ukrainian Marines held at extraordinary cost from October 2023 until July 2024, had proven that opposed river crossings of the Dnipro were not viable in the drone era. Assumption 3, with those two premises in place, Russia could safely thin its Kherson garrison, redirect manpower to the Donetsk grinder, and treat the West Bank to East Bank line as a stable partition until diplomacy decided otherwise. These assumptions were not neutral analysis. They were the operational scaffolding of what became known in Western capitals as the contained war thesis, the idea that this conflict had geographical limits, that the front lines had settled, and that time was on Russia's side. Every one of those assumptions has now collapsed. The Kinburn strike is the proof. The details matter. The Kinburn Spit was not lost in a single engagement. It was lost through a months-long strangulation campaign that began in early spring 2026, when Ukraine's unmanned systems forces, under the command of Colonel Robert Magyar Brovdy, launched what the USF itself designated middle strike operations. The concept is deceptively simple and doctrinally devastating. Short and mid-range strike drones operating in layered swarms systematically hunt Russian logistics behind the front line, fuel trucks, ammunition depots, supply columns, command vehicles, and the road nodes that connect them. The target is not the frontline infantryman. The target is the calorie, the shell, the liter of diesel that keeps him in position. On June 9th, the Ukrainian partisan network Atesh reported that units of Russia's 337th Regiment on the left bank of Kherson had begun abandoning positions because deliveries of ammunition, fuel, and food had been cut off. That was 2 weeks before the flag went up on Kinburn. 2 weeks. Think about that for a second. Ukrainian forces did not need to storm the peninsula. They needed to starve it. And once the starvation had done its work, the fire strike that finished the job was almost administrative. This is where it gets more dangerous for Moscow. Because the same doctrine that broke Kinburn is now being applied along the entire left bank of the Dnipro. In the June 24th and June 29th Russian offensive campaign assessments, the Institute for the Study of War noted that neither Russian nor Ukrainian sources were reporting significant ground activity in the Kherson direction, which in the current information environment does not mean the front is quiet. It means the front is being reconfigured by fires rather than by maneuver. Ukrainian strikes are hollowing out the Russian rear across occupied Kherson, and Russian forces, according to ISW's June 21st assessment, are simultaneously being denied their ability to sustain logistics and transport fuel across the Kerch Strait toward Crimea. Read those two data points together. The northern approach to Crimea through occupied Kherson is being logistically strangled at the same time as the southern approach through Kerch is being interdicted. That is not a coincidence. That is a doctrine, and the Kinburn Spit is the first territorial confirmation that the doctrine works. Here is where mainstream framing misses it, and misses it badly. Most Western coverage of the June 25th event described the raising of the flag as a symbolic victory, a morale boost, or, in the more cautious formulations, a limited tactical gain in a largely static front. That framing is wrong, and it is wrong in a specific way that has been wrong before. In November 2022, the same commentariat described the liberation of Kherson City as a symbolic victory that would not fundamentally shift the war. It shifted the war. It exposed Russia's inability to sustain a river-crossing occupation. It forced a reorganization of Russian Southern Command that has never fully recovered, and it opened the strategic space for the strike campaign against Crimean logistics that is now in its third year. The mainstream framing missed it then because it was measuring the war by square kilometers. It is missing it now for the same reason. The Kinburn Spit is roughly 40 square kilometers of sand. Its strategic value is not in the sand. It is in what the sand permits. Control of Kinburn gives Ukrainian forces line of sight and drone range coverage of the entire Dnipro estuary, the maritime approach to the Kherson littoral, and a forward observation platform for anything Russia attempts to move by water along that coastline. In the language of naval doctrine, this is the closure of a maritime choke point. In the language of ground doctrine, this is the establishment of a fire's bubble over the Russian left bank. Now consider what Russia's official response has and has not said. The Russian Ministry of Defense has not publicly acknowledged the loss of Kinburn. That silence is itself evidence. When Russia loses ground, it can defend as tactically insignificant. It typically acknowledges the withdrawal and reframes it as a straightening of the line. When Russia loses ground that exposes a structural weakness in its defensive concept, it goes silent. The silence around Kinburn is the second category. Meanwhile, Ukrainian military intelligence, the same organization whose special forces raided the Spit in August 2024 and killed dozens of Russian soldiers on the ground, has begun publishing footage that the Kremlin cannot easily counter, geolocated video of the flag, drone footage of the fire strike, and statements from named Ukrainian commanders. The Southern Command's follow-up statement contained a line that most Western outlets buried near the bottom of their coverage. Quote, "We are not stopping. One day our tanks will reach Jankoy." End quote. Jankoy is not in Kherson. Jankoy is in northern Crimea. That was not rhetoric. That was a doctrinal declaration. The Kherson front is not being treated by Ukrainian command as an endpoint. It is being treated as a launch corridor. There is a clock ticking right now because Moscow understands this, even if the Western press does not. According to Ukrainska Pravda's June 29th reporting, Ukrainian officials assess that Russian forces currently lack the assets and personnel required to conduct their own opposed crossing of the Dnipro in the opposite direction. That is not a small statement. For most of 2024 and into 2025, Russian military bloggers openly speculated about a right bank offensive that would push Ukrainian forces back from Kherson city and re-establish Russian artillery dominance over the western estuary. That option is now off the table, at least in the near term. Russia has neither the pontoon capacity, the air defense coverage, nor the manpower reserve to attempt it, while its left bank logistics are being systematically dismantled. The strategic initiative on the southern axis has shifted. It has shifted to Kiev, and Kinburn is the ground truth confirmation. Let us slow down here, because this is where the doctrinal pattern becomes visible. What Ukraine has demonstrated across the Kherson front in the last 6 months is a 5-stage operational sequence that Western militaries will be studying for a generation. Stage 1. Identify a Russian position that depends on a single, vulnerable logistics artery. Stage 2. Interdict that artery using layered drone strikes at ranges beyond the reach of forward Russian air defense. Stage 3, allow the position to degrade through attrition of supplies, morale, and unit cohesion. Stage 4, apply a concentrated fire strike at the moment of maximum degradation. Stage 5, send a small ground element, often reconnaissance or special forces, to confirm the collapse and mark the ground. That is the sequence that unfolded on the Kinburn Spit. It is the same sequence being applied to Russian positions along the Zaporizhzhia axis, and it is the sequence that has begun to appear in Ukrainian operations against Russian Black Sea Fleet infrastructure. The Institute for the Study of War, in its June 14th assessment, noted that the Russian military command was reportedly planning to relocate the remaining Black Sea Fleet command structures out of occupied Crimea. That is not a decision made by a command that believes the Southern Front is stable. That is a decision made by a command that believes the Southern Front is being dismantled around it. Now step back and look at the bigger picture. The Kremlin's entire theory of victory in this war has rested, for at least the last 2 years, on a single proposition, that time favors Russia, that Ukraine will exhaust its manpower before Russia does, that Western aid will falter before Russian oil revenue does, and that the front lines, however painful, will hold long enough for Moscow to outlast the political will in Washington, Berlin, and Paris. The Kherson breakdown attacks that proposition at its foundation. Because if Russian defensive positions can be systematically hollowed out by unmanned systems, at ranges Russian counter-battery cannot reach using munitions Ukraine can produce domestically at scale, then the mathematics of attrition no longer favor Moscow. They favor the side with the better drone doctrine. And the better drone doctrine is, unambiguously and by Russia's own admission on its military telegram channels, Ukrainian. Here is where it gets more dangerous. Because the Kinburn precedent will not stay in Kherson. The same operational logic that stripped a Russian foothold off a Black Sea peninsula can be applied to any Russian position anywhere along the 1,100-kilometer front that depends on vulnerable logistics. That includes the Russian salients around Vovchansk in Kharkiv. It includes the Russian positions on the Chasiv Yar heights in Donetsk. It includes, most significantly, the Russian defensive belts on the Crimean Isthmus itself. If the Kinburn model scales, and there is currently no Russian technical or doctrinal answer that suggests it will not, then the entire Russian defensive posture in southern Ukraine is exposed to progressive strangulation. That is not a Ukrainian propaganda claim. That is the geometry of the battlefield as it now stands in the summer of 2026. The escalation risks from here are not theoretical. They are already being telegraphed. Consider what Moscow's options actually are. Option 1, reinforce the Kherson left bank with troops pulled from other axes, which would relieve pressure on Ukrainian forces in Donetsk and Zaporizhzhia and potentially open new opportunities for Ukrainian counteraction there. Option 2, accept the progressive loss of the left bank and fall back toward the administrative border of Crimea, which would concede the entire Kherson Oblast and shatter the Kremlin's territorial narrative for domestic Russian consumption. Option 3, escalate vertically, either by expanding the missile campaign against Ukrainian critical infrastructure, by drawing Belarus more openly into the war, or by signaling nuclear posture changes in an attempt to freeze Western support for the drone strike doctrine that is dismantling Russian positions. Every one of these options carries a cost Moscow has been trying to avoid, and that is precisely why the Kinburn moment is dangerous. It is not dangerous because Ukraine is winning too fast. It is dangerous because Russia is running out of non-escalatory answers to a war it can no longer stabilize by defensive means. That is not speculation. That is the pattern. President Putin and senior Kremlin officials, in the days immediately following the Kinburn flag-raising, reiterated Russia's commitment to what the ISW June 23rd assessment described as the original war aims of complete Ukrainian capitulation. That language was chosen deliberately. It is the language of a leadership that cannot admit tactical defeat because it has committed rhetorically to strategic totality. And leaders who cannot admit tactical defeat are, historically, the leaders most likely to reach for escalation. Not because escalation solves the underlying military problem, it does not, but because escalation buys time, muddies the narrative, and shifts the international conversation away from the ground truth. The ground truth is that Kinburn is gone. The ground truth is that the left bank of the Dnipro is being strangled. The ground truth is that the contained war thesis is finished. This is where the mainstream analysts will be tempted to reach for their familiar reassurances. They will say that the Ukrainian gain is limited. They will say that Russia still holds the vast majority of occupied territory. They will say that a single peninsula does not a counteroffensive make. All of that is technically true, and all of it misses the point. The point is not the peninsula. The point is the method. The Kinburn spit was held for 4 years by a Russian garrison that was supposed to be permanent. It was dismantled in months by a Ukrainian doctrine that Russia has no counter to. Multiply that method by every vulnerable Russian position along the southern front, and the strategic map of this war looks fundamentally different by the end of 2026 than it did at the beginning. There is one final layer, and it is the layer that Moscow understands most acutely. The Kinburn spit sits directly on the sea approach to Odessa. It sits directly on the maritime choke point that governs Ukrainian grain exports, Ukrainian naval drone operations, and any future Ukrainian amphibious posture toward the Crimean Peninsula. Russian control of Kinburn was, for 4 years, the northernmost anchor of Russia's Black Sea denial strategy. That anchor has been cut. Ukraine's unmanned systems forces, its naval drone units, and its long-range strike aviation now operate from a coastline that is measurably longer, measurably more secure, and measurably closer to the Crimean rear than it was 30 days ago. The Southern Command's promise that Ukrainian tanks would one day reach Donskoy was not a boast for domestic consumption. It was a message to Moscow, and Moscow received it. The verdict is this: the Kherson breakdown is not a symbolic photograph on a strip of sand. It is the visible edge of a doctrinal collapse in Russia's southern defensive concept. It is the confirmation that the Dnipro is not a wall, that the Kinburn foothold was not permanent, and that the frozen front thesis was a Western convenience, not a battlefield reality. Ukraine has demonstrated, on ground, Russia had held since the early weeks of the invasion, that it possesses the doctrine, the industrial base, and the operational patience to unwind Russian defensive positions systematically and at scale. Russia has demonstrated, by its silence and by the relocation of its Black Sea Fleet Command, that it recognizes what has happened even if it will not say so publicly, and the wider war, the war that Western capitals were told had settled into geographical stalemate, has just been shown to be nothing of the kind. What comes next is the question that will define the second half of 2026. Whether Moscow accepts the progressive loss of the Kherson left bank and prepares a fallback to the Crimean Isthmus. Whether the Kremlin attempts a vertical escalation to freeze the Ukrainian strike doctrine before it reaches the peninsula itself. Whether Belarus, which has spent the last months being maneuvered ever closer to the war by pressure from Moscow, is drawn in as a diversionary front to relieve the southern squeeze. And whether Western capitals finally understand that the war they thought was frozen was, in fact, being quietly remapped by drones, by logistics interdiction, and by a Ukrainian doctrine that treats every Russian position as a target waiting to be starved. None of those questions has been answered yet. All of them are now on the table because of a flag on a peninsula that most Western viewers had never heard of before this week. That is how strategic turning points arrive, not with the loudest engagements, but with the quietest confirmations that an assumption everyone was relying on is no longer true. This channel will be tracking every next step in this unfolding southern collapse. The Russian response, the doctrinal spread of the Kinburn model to other axes, the Crimean logistics squeeze, and the escalation choices Moscow is now being forced to make. If understanding the real shape of this war matters to you, subscribe and turn on notifications, because the Kherson breakdown is not the end of a story. It is the beginning of the chapter that decides how the Southern Front is finally settled. The clock is running. The next move belongs to Moscow. And when it comes, we will be here to break it down.